In the year 1715 the Sun King finally set. Louis XIV, the longest reigning monarch in European history, died in his colossal palace at Versailles. He left behind a France that was culturally dominant, militarily exhausted and financially destitute. The king had spent 72 years waging expensive wars and building extravagant monuments to his own glory. When the accountants finally opened the books after his death, they found a disaster. The national debt was astronomical. It amounted to roughly 3 billion livres. To put that in perspective, the total annual tax revenue of the French government was only about 145 million livres. France was not just broke, it was hopelessly insolvent. The interest payments alone on the debt were swallowing almost every penny the tax collectors could scrape together. The economy was paralyzed. Merchants couldn't trade because nobody had any money to buy goods. The peasants were starving because the taxes were crushing them. The army hadn't been paid in months. The crown passed to Louis XV, but he was only 5 years old. The real power rested in the hands of the regent, the Duke of Orleans. The regent was a man known for his intelligence and his debauchery, but when faced with the financial ruin of the kingdom, he was desperate. His advisors suggested the usual medieval solutions: repudiate the debt, declare bankruptcy, or melt down the currency and mix base metals into the silver coins. These were short-term fixes that would only destroy the country's credit rating. For a century the regent needed a miracle, and as it happened, a miracle worker had just arrived in Paris. His name was John Law. He was a Scot, a tall, handsome and incredibly charming man. He was also a fugitive. Years earlier in London he had killed a romantic rival in a duel and fled to the continent to escape the hangman's noose. For 2 decades Law had traveled the capitals of Europe, making a living at the card tables. He was a professional gambler, a man who understood odds, risk and human psychology better than any banker. But John Law was more than just a card sharp. He was a brilliant self-taught economist. While watching gold and silver coins move across the gambling tables of Venice, Genoa and Amsterdam, he had an epiphany about the nature of money itself. For centuries the world believed that money was gold and silver. Value was intrinsic to the metal. Law realized this was wrong. Money, he argued, was not wealth. Money was merely the tool by which wealth was exchanged. It was a medium of trade, and the problem with France was that it didn't have enough of the medium. France was suffering from a severe deflationary crisis. There simply wasn't enough gold and silver coins circulating in the economy to facilitate trade. A farmer might have a barn full of wheat and a weaver might have a shop full of cloth, but they couldn't trade because neither had the silver coins to make the transaction. Law secured an audience with a desperate regent. He laid out a radical revolutionary plan. He told the Duke of Orleans that gold was an outdated shackle on the economy. A modern state, he argued, needed a modern currency. His proposal was shocking to the 18th century mind. Banish gold coins and replace them with paper money. Law argued that paper money could be printed in any amount needed to stimulate the economy. If there was more money circulating, people would buy more goods, merchants would hire more workers, farmers would plant more crops, the economy would grow, and out of that growth the king could collect enough taxes to pay off the massive war debt. It sounded too good to be true. It sounded like alchemy, but the regent had no other options. He gave the Scottish gambler the green light to take over the French economy. In May 1716 Law established the Banque Générale. It was the first central bank in the history of France. The bank began to issue paper banknotes. Crucially, Law promised that these notes were fully backed by gold and silver held in the bank's vaults, and that anyone could exchange their paper for coin at any time. At first the French people were skeptical. They remembered previous kings who had debased the currency. Why trust a piece of paper with John Law's signature on it? But Law knew how to build confidence. He ensured that his paper notes were actually better than metal coins. The official silver coins of France fluctuated in value depending on the whims of the government, but Law promised his banknotes would always be redeemable for a fixed weight of silver. Suddenly merchants preferred the paper. It was lighter, easier to transport, and its value was stable. The paper money began to circulate, and just as Law had predicted, the economy began to thaw. Trade picked up, taxes began to flow into the treasury. The regent was delighted. The Scottish gambler was a genius, but this was only the first phase of Law's master plan. The bank was just the engine. Now he needed a vehicle. He needed a way to suck up the massive mountain of government debt that was still crushing the state. Law looked across the Atlantic Ocean. France possessed a vast territory in North America known as Louisiana, named after the late Sun King. It stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Canada. It was a massive untamed wilderness centered around the Mississippi River. To the average Frenchman, Louisiana was a mystery, but to John Law it was an opportunity. He saw a blank slate onto which he could project the dreams of avarice. In 1717 Law convinced the regent to grant him a trading monopoly. He formed the Company of the West, later known as the Mississippi Company. The French government gave Law exclusive rights to all trade, commerce and colonization in this vast American territory. The deal was simple on paper. The company would develop Louisiana, find gold and silver mines similar to those the Spanish had found in Mexico, and establish lucrative tobacco plantations. The profits from this new world would flow back to France, enriching the shareholders and saving the kingdom. Law now controlled the national bank and the nation's most valuable overseas assets. He was ready to combine them into a financial machine that the world had never seen before. He was about to create the first modern stock market bubble. He was going to turn the debts of a bankrupt king into the dream of infinite wealth. To make the Mississippi Company a success, John Law needed investors. He needed the French people to take their savings out from under their mattresses and put them into his new venture. But in 1717, Louisiana was nothing but a swamp. There were no cities, no mines, and barely any French settlers. It was a vast fever-ridden wilderness. So Law did what every great promoter does when the product is lacking. He sold the dream. He launched one of the most aggressive propaganda campaigns in history. He hired illustrators to create beautiful engravings of the Mississippi Territory. These images didn't show the reality of alligator-infested bayous and mosquitoes thick enough to choke a man. Instead, they depicted a Garden of Eden. The engravings showed happy, docile natives coming forward to offer French settlers massive chunks of gold and emeralds. They showed fertile plains waiting for the plow. They showed mountains of silver gleaming in the sun. Law, I guess, message to the French public was simple. The Spanish found mountains of gold in Mexico. We have found mountains of gold in Mississippi. All you have to do to get your share is buy stock in my company. He released the first batch of shares to the public. He priced them at 500 livres each. But here was the stroke of financial genius that would hook the entire nation. He allowed investors to pay for these shares not just with gold or silver but with government debt bonds. Remember, France was drowning in war debt. Thousands of citizens held these government bonds, the billets d'état, which were practically worthless because the king couldn't pay the interest. They were trading at a massive discount, sometimes worth only 20 of their face value. Law told the people, give me your worthless government debt and I will give you a share in a company that owns half of America. It was an irresistible offer. It was a debt for equity swap on a national scale. The French public rushed to trade their bad debt for a piece of the Louisiana dream. The first share issue sold out immediately. Law issued more and more to ensure the price kept rising. Law utilized the power of his other creation, the Banque Générale. He essentially merged the bank and the company. He used the bank's printing presses to print paper money, which the bank then lent to investors at low interest rates, specifically so they could buy Mississippi shares. It was a perfect self-reinforcing loop. The bank printed money, people borrowed the money, they used the money to buy shares. The buying pressure pushed the stock price up. Seeing the price go up, more people borrowed more money to buy more shares. By 1719, Paris had descended into total madness. The price of a single share, originally 500 livres, smashed through 1,000, then 2,000, then 5,000. The center of this financial hurricane was a narrow street in Paris called the Rue Quincampoix. This was where the traders gathered. It became the Wall Street of the 18th century, but far more chaotic. The street was so crowded with people trying to buy stock that guards had to block off both ends at night to clear the bodies. Aristocrats, soldiers, servants, and priests rubbed shoulders in the mud, screaming out prices. The social order of France evaporated. The only thing that mattered was whether you owned Mississippi stock. There are famous stories of the hysteria from the street. One legend tells of a hunchback who made a small fortune simply by standing in the street and renting out his back as a writing desk for brokers to sign contracts on. Another tells of a woman who instructed her carriage driver to deliberately crash her carriage into a post near where John Law was eating dinner just so she could pretend to be injured and have a chance to speak with him about buying shares. The wealth being generated was staggering. Servants who had invested their meager wages suddenly found themselves richer than their masters. A new word had to be invented to describe these people. The French called them millionaires. It was the first time this word was widely used in history. By the second half of 1719, the share price hit 10,000 livres. The company was now valued at more than all the gold and silver in Europe. John Law was no longer just a Scottish gambler. He was the most powerful man in France. The regent appointed him Controller General of Finances. He effectively controlled the tax collection, the mint, the colonial trade, and the national debt. He was the entire economy, and on paper he had saved France the massive national debt that had crippled the state. After Louis XIV's death had vanished, it had all been converted into Mississippi shares. The king didn't owe money anymore, the company did. And as long as the share price stayed high, everyone was happy. But behind the scenes, Law faced a terrifying problem. The hype was moving faster than the reality. He had promised mountains of gold and thriving cities in Louisiana, but in reality the colony was a disaster. To keep the stock Price-up law needed to show progress. He needed to show that Louisiana was being populated, but no respectable Frenchman wanted to move to a swamp, so law turned to coercion. He swept the prisons of Paris. He took thieves, murderers, and debtors and put them in chains. He marched them to the ports to be shipped to America. He rounded up prostitutes and homeless women from the streets and forced them to marry the male prisoners before dragging them onto the ships. These unfortunate souls were paraded through Paris on their way to the coast. Law-esque propagandists told the investors that these were colonists eager to build the new empire. In reality, they were a slave labor force being sent to die and die they did. The conditions on the ships were horrific. Disease ran rampant. Of the thousands sent to Louisiana in these years, it is estimated that less than 20 survived. They died of yellow fever, starvation, and exhaustion. The Garden of Eden was a graveyard back in Paris. Law suppressed these reports. He censored the letters coming back from the colony. He bribed newspaper editors. He kept the printing presses running hot, churning out more paper money to keep the liquidity flowing in the Rue Quincampoix. But a bubble is a fragile thing. It relies entirely on faith. As long as everyone believes the price will go up, it goes up. But the singular moment that the smart money decides to cash out, the gravity of reality takes hold. In late 1719 the cracks began to appear. A few wealthy investors, princes, and savvy merchants looked at the numbers. They calculated the real value of the trade with Louisiana, which was zero, and compared it to the stock valuation. They realized it was a hallucination. They decided to quietly exit. They sold their shares at the peak, collecting millions in paper banknotes, but they didn't want the paper. They knew the paper was being printed into infinity. They wanted something real. They took their wagon loads of paper notes to the bank, General Law's bank, and demanded to exchange them for gold and silver coin, as was their legal right. At first Law paid them. He had to. The entire system depended on the promise that the paper was as good as gold. But as more and more millionaires tried to cash out, the bank's vaults began to empty. One famous story involves the Prince de Conti, a powerful nobleman who was angry with Law. He sent 3 wagons to the bank and demanded they be filled with gold in exchange for his paper notes. Law paid him, but he was terrified. He realized that if just a few more princes did the same thing, the bank would break. Law went to the regent and begged for help. He argued that these people were sabotaging the economy by hoarding gold. He convinced the regent to pass a series of tyrannical laws to stop the bleeding. First they made it illegal to export gold from France, then they devalued the gold coinage, trying to make the paper seem more valuable. Finally, in a desperate move that signaled the beginning of the end, Law convinced the government to make it illegal to own large amounts of gold or silver jewelry. They sent the police to raid the homes of the wealthy. Servants were paid rewards to inform on their masters if they were hiding gold. The French government was now confiscating real wealth to force people to use the fake wealth they had created. The atmosphere in Paris shifted from euphoria to paranoia. The trading in the Rue Quincampoix became violent. The smart money had already left. Now the middle class was holding the bag. They looked at their expensive shares and their stacks of paper money, and for the first time they wondered if there was actually anything behind it all. John Law, the man who had bought the world, was sitting on a throne of dynamite, and in early 1720 the fuse was lit. The year 1720 began with a cold wind blowing through the streets of Paris, a wind that carried with it the first scent of panic. The great Mississippi bubble had peaked. The stock price, which had touched the dizzying height of 10,000 livres per share, was beginning to wobble. The psychological spell that John Law had cast over the nation was breaking. For 3 years the French people had suspended their disbelief. They had believed that paper was gold. They had believed that a swamp in Louisiana was a paradise. They had believed that debt was wealth. But now the gravity of economics was reasserting itself. The crisis began with a slow leak. The wealthy and the well-connected, the princes of the blood and the inner circle of the regent, were the first to see the writing on the wall. They realized that the paper profits were illusory. They quietly began to sell. They dumped their Mississippi shares by the thousands, collecting millions in paper banknotes, but they didn't keep the paper. They knew that Law had printed far too much of it. The volume of paper money in circulation had ballooned to over 1 billion livres, an amount that far exceeded all the goods and services in the entire French economy. The smart money knew that inflation was coming, so they took their paper millions and converted them into anything real they could find. They bought diamonds, they bought silverware, they bought country estates. And most damaging of all, they demanded gold coin from the bank. John Law watched this exodus with growing terror. He was now the Controller General of Finances, effectively the Prime Minister of France. He had absolute power, but he was powerless to stop the market from correcting itself. He saw the gold draining out of his vaults and realized that if the trend continued, the Bank General would be insolvent within weeks. He decided to fight the market, but he didn't fight it with economics. He fought it with tyranny. In January and February of 1720, law convinced the regent to pass a series of totalitarian decrees that turned France into a financial police state. Since people were preferring gold to his paper money, law decided to criminalize gold. He issued a royal edict banning the export of gold and silver coins. When that didn't stop the bleeding, he went further. He made it illegal for any French citizen to own more than 500 livres in gold or silver coin. It was a shocking violation of property rights. Overnight, the traditional money that people had used for thousands of years became contraband. To enforce this law unleashed a wave of terror. He empowered the police to conduct warrantless searches of private homes. They tore up floorboards and broke open cellars looking for hidden stashes of coin. Worst of all, law encouraged a culture of betrayal. He offered a reward to anyone who informed on a neighbor or master hiding gold. Servants denounced their employers. Brothers denounced brothers. The prisons filled with people whose only crime was trying to save their life savings from a crashing system. But the most bizarre decree was yet to come. In a desperate attempt to prop up the value of his paper shares, law declared that the manufacturing and selling of gold, jewelry and silverware was prohibited. He tried to erase precious metals from the collective consciousness of France. He wanted to leave the people with no option but paper. For a brief moment the terror worked. People were too afraid to use gold, so they used paper. But this created a new monster, hyperinflation. Because the wealthy were dumping their stocks, there was a flood of paper money hitting the streets. But because the government had banned gold, all that money chased the few remaining real goods. Food, cloth and land prices skyrocketed. The cost of bread doubled, then tripled. A bushel of wheat that cost a few livres in 1719 cost hundreds in 1720. The millionaires who had felt so rich in December found that their paper fortunes could barely buy dinner. In March, the illusion of wealth was being stripped away by the reality of the grocery bill. Law was trapped. He tried to stabilize the stock price by pegging it. He declared that the bank would buy any Mississippi share for 9,000 livres. This was a fatal mistake. It meant that the government was effectively printing infinite money to buy worthless stock. The printing presses at the bank ran red hot. They worked day and night, churning out millions of livres just to pay off the investors who were selling their shares back to the state. The money supply exploded. The currency became a joke. Foreign merchants refused to accept French paper. Imports stopped. Shortages began. By May 1720, John Law, the man who had promised to eliminate debt, had created a financial apocalypse. The amount of paper money in circulation was 4 times larger than the total value of all the gold and silver in the kingdom. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that Law made his fatal error. He decided that he had to deflate the bubble. He had to bring the value of the paper money back in line with reality. He approached the problem like a mathematician, forgetting that he was dealing with human beings. On May 24, 1720, Law issued the infamous Edict of May. The decree announced that over the next few months the official value of the Mississippi shares would be reduced from 900 livres to 5,000. It also stated that the value of the paper bank notes would be cut in half. Law thought this was a sensible adjustment. He was trying to conduct a controlled landing of the economy. He thought the people would understand that this was necessary to save the system. He was wrong. The public did not see it as an adjustment. They saw it as theft. The Edict of May was a declaration of bankruptcy by the state. The government was admitting that the money in people's pockets was worth half of what it said on the face. The trust, which was the only thing holding the system together, evaporated instantly. The reaction was violent. Paris exploded. The mob poured into the streets screaming for Law's head. They called him a thief, a liar, and a foreigner who had come to destroy France. The regent, terrified by the anger of the crowd, was forced to revoke the edict just 6 days later. But it was too late. The spell was broken. You cannot unring a bell, and you cannot restore faith once you have admitted it was all a lie. John Law was stripped of his title as Controller General. For his own safety, the regent placed him under house arrest in the Palais Royal. The man who had been the toast of Europe, who had been courted by dukes and bishops, was now a prisoner, listening to the chants of the mob outside demanding his execution. The summer of 1720 was a long, hot nightmare. The system entered a death spiral. The bank stopped converting paper to coin entirely. The shares of the Mississippi Company plummeted, crashing from 900 to 50, then 2,000. In July, the final tragedy occurred. The bank, a general desperate to maintain some semblance of order, announced that it would exchange a tiny amount of paper for silver, but only for the very poor and only in small denominations. On July 17, a massive crowd gathered outside the bank's headquarters on the Rue Vivienne. Thousands of desperate people, maids, laborers, shoemakers, pressed against the gates, clutching their worthless paper notes, hoping to get just a few coins to buy bread for their families. The crowd grew too large. Panic set in the crush. People began to fall. The guards Were overwhelmed for hours. The mass of humanity pushed and shoved in the stifling heat. When the crowd finally dispersed, the street was littered with the dead. 15 people had been trampled to death or suffocated in the press. The mood in Paris shifted from anger to cold, murderous rage. The mob picked up the bodies of 3 of the victims. They placed them on makeshift stretchers and marched them through the streets of Paris. They didn't go to the cemetery. They marched straight to the Palais Royal, the home of the regent, and the prison of John Law. They held the corpses up to the windows of the palace, screaming, "Behold the fruit of your system!" It was the closest France had come to revolution in centuries. The young King Louis XV, only 10 years old, looked out the window and saw his subjects waving dead bodies at him. It was a trauma that would haunt the monarchy for the rest of the century. Inside the palace, John Law cowered in a back room. He realized that his life was in imminent danger. The regent who had protected him for so long could no longer hold back the tide. The experiment was over. The system was dead. The only question now was whether John Law would survive the fallout. The economy was wrecked. The shops were closed. The streets were dangerous. The French people who had dreamed of easy wealth woke up to find themselves holding pockets full of confetti. The Mississippi Company, which was supposed to own half of America, was revealed to be a hollow shell. As the autumn of 1720 approached, John Law knew he had to leave. He had arrived in France as a savior, a genius with a mathematical formula for utopia. He was leaving as a pariah, the architect of the greatest financial disaster in history. But escaping France would not be easy. He was the most hated man in the kingdom, and every road to the border was watched by people who wanted to kill him. The autumn of 1720 in Paris was a season of reckoning. The leaves turned brown and fell in the Tuileries garden, and with them fell the last hopes of the French investors. The Mississippi bubble had not just burst, it had evaporated, leaving behind a crater that would scar the nation for a century. Inside the Palais Royal, John Law was a prisoner of his own creation. The man who had briefly been the wealthiest private citizen in the world, the man who owned 21 estates and whose wife wore diamonds the size of walnuts, was now destitute. His assets in France had been frozen. His shares were worthless. The mob outside was baying for his blood, chanting songs about hanging the paper tyrant. The regent, the Duke of Orleans, was in a difficult position. He had authorized every step of Law's scheme. He had profited from it. If Law was put on trial, the regent's own complicity would be exposed, so a secret arrangement was made. John Law would not be executed. He would be exiled. In December 1720, under the cover of darkness, John Law slipped out of the side door of the palace. He climbed into a nondescript carriage with his son. He carried with him only a few hundred gold coins and a single diamond ring, all that remained of an empire that had been valued at billions. He fled toward the Belgian border. It was a humiliating escape. At one town he was recognized by a local official who tried to arrest him. Law had to produce a passport signed by the king himself to be allowed to pass. He crossed the border into Brussels, looking back at the country he had promised to save and which he had instead left in ruins. He would never set foot in France again. Back in Paris, the government faced a catastrophic mess. The economy was littered with billions of liars and worthless paper banknotes. The Mississippi Company shares were trading at the price of waste. Paper commerce had stopped completely because no one knew what anything was worth. The people were angry, hungry, and demanding justice. The regent turned to the Paris brothers, a family of hard-nosed financiers who had always hated John Law. They were appointed to clean up the disaster. They launched a brutal inquisitorial process known as the visa. It was a financial witch hunt. The government ordered every single person in France who held paper money or company shares to bring them to the authorities for inspection. They established a tribunal to examine how each person had acquired their wealth. It was a forensic audit of the entire nation. Over 500,000 households, virtually the entire middle and upper class of France, were investigated. If the tribunal decided that you were a profiteer who had made money by speculating, they confiscated your wealth. If they decided you were a bona fide investor who had simply been duped, they gave you government bonds worth a tiny fraction of your paper loss. The visa was a scene of national trauma. Thousands of clerks worked day and night in the Louvre sorting through mountains of paper. The secrets of the rich were laid bare. Reputations were destroyed. The millionaires who had ridden in carriages 6 months earlier were reduced to begging. The process culminated in a massive bonfire. The government gathered up the billions of leaves of John Law's banknotes, the paper that had once bought castles and ships. They piled them into great cages in the Place Vendôme, and then before a cheering crowd they set them on fire. The French people watched their life savings burn. It was a symbolic purging. The smoke that rose over Paris carried away the dream of the Mississippi. The immediate economic depression was severe. Suicide spiked. Businesses collapsed, but the long-term damage was far more profound. John Law had poisoned the well of finance. In France for generations because of the trauma of 1720 the French people developed a deep cultural hatred of paper money stock markets and central banks. They viewed banks not as engines of growth but as tools of theft while Great Britain moved forward refining the Bank of England and building a sophisticated financial system that allowed them to borrow money cheaply to build the Royal Navy and the Industrial Revolution. France moved backward. The French went back to hoarding gold under floorboards. They refused to create a central bank again for another 80 years. This financial backwardness had lethal consequences for the French monarchy. Throughout the 18th century, France fought a series of expensive wars against Britain. Britain funded these wars by borrowing from its own people. Through a trusted central bank, France had to fund them by squeezing the peasants with taxes because no one trusted the king's credit. This inability to manage debt is what eventually killed the French Empire. By 1789 the French crown was bankrupt again, crushed by the cost of helping the American Revolution. King Louis XVI tried to raise taxes but the people refused. The result was the French Revolution. In a very real sense, the guillotine that severed the head of Louis XV was sharpened by the failure of John Law 70 years earlier. And what of the man himself? What happened to the gambler? John Law spent the final 9 years of his life as a wanderer. He went to London where he was initially welcomed as a celebrity curiosity, but he had no money to invest. He drifted to Munich and finally to Venice. He lived in a small rented apartment. He returned to his roots. He spent his evenings in the casinos of Venice gambling for small stakes, using his mathematical mind to win enough silver to pay for his dinner. He was a gray shadowy figure in the corner of the room. A man who had once bought half of America now playing cards for the price of a bottle of wine. He never stopped believing in his system. He wrote letters to the French government begging them to let him return, insisting that his ideas were sound and that he had only failed because of panic and bad luck. They never replied. In 1729 John Law caught pneumonia. He died poor and alone in Venice. He was buried in the church of San Gimignano. His epitaph, written by a sarcastic French poet, read, "Here lies that celebrated Scotsman, that peerless calculator who by the rules of algebra sent France to the poorhouse." But Law was not a con man in the traditional sense. He was a tragic visionary. He was right about the future. The world eventually did move to paper money, central banks and credit economies. Every dollar, euro and pound in our pockets today is a descendant of John Law's idea. We live in the world he imagined. His mistake was ignoring human nature. He forgot that money is not just math. It is trust. He treated the economy like a laboratory experiment, pushing it until it exploded. He proved that while you can print money, you cannot print value, you cannot print confidence, and you certainly cannot print reality. The Mississippi bubble remains the ultimate cautionary tale of financial hubris. It reminds us that when the line between investment and gambling blurs, disaster is inevitable. It reminds us that whenever someone promises infinite wealth with no risk, the end result is always a bonfire. France recovered eventually, but the scars of the Mississippi never truly healed. It stands as a monument to the moment when a nation got drunk on hope and woke up with the worst hangover in history. The swamp in Louisiana is now a part of the United States, but in the financial history of the world it will always belong to John Law. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Here we go. Thank you.